Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Youth Rights Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about the connections between colonialism and youth oppression around the world. We're here with multiple NYRA members. I'm your host, Zane Miller, and y'all can go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Hello, my name is Amaris. I'm quite a new NYRA member. So I'm a university student currently studying international relations. And youth rights is something that I'm interested in. I consider myself kind of a youth rights activist. I'm just hoping to spread awareness of the topic.
Hi, I'm Imogen. I was on the Devin Price episode, and my background's in self-directed education, which I do consider to be kind of a pre-colonial form of education. And I'm also interested in returning to kind of pre-colonial forms of like the family. That's kind of why I'm interested in this specifically.
Cool.
All right. Hi, I'm Susan. I've been a part of NYRA for about a year and a half. And Imogen and I are both here in Seattle. And, I have gotten a NYRA node started here in Seattle and have been on a few episodes also, and not at all an expert on this topic, but it sounded really interesting. So looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Amaris, do you want to go ahead and kick us off and just talk about, going into these connections?
Youth rights and anti-colonialism are two things that aren't really mentioned together. As someone who has kind of studied colonialism as part of my degree, I'm not an expert on any. I'm literally just an undergraduate, but it's something that has always interested me. So like my dad was actually Nigerian. And so he kind of, even though like this would have been something that happened long before he was born, like even nowadays, like the traces of colonialism are basically still in our society and still in colonized societies. I think this kind of came to mind because actually I was talking to Zane, and we were kind of just having like an onboarding conversation about youth rights. And I noticed that you said that kind of for a lot of history in a lot of like all over the globe, there has been youth oppression. And while like this is kind of true, I also kind of thought about pre-colonial societies. So like, pre-colonial Africa, indigenous societies, Polynesian societies. And like what I've learned is how children operate in those societies is like very different to what we have here right now in kind of the West. And even like kind of the idea of childhood, while like, obviously people are different ages, people have like different life experiences. The idea of childhood in and of itself is very much a social construct. And what that means is like, depending on where you live, like your race, like all of these factors, your childhood is going to be different, and how that society defines childhood or what it should be or how you spend it is going to be like very different. In our world, children are very much cut off from society. I feel like young people are kind of segregated to, I believe, two places, that being the home and the school. So children very much are segregated between these two places. And there's very much this idea that there's the young people's world, and then there's like the real world, like the adult world. Like, yeah, I think we've all probably heard like, when you go into the real world, but like, it's not like we're all in like it's not when before you're 18, you're in some sort of simulation. You are in the real world and they are like real consequences to certain things. It's just that, young people in the West are sheltered in a way, or like kind of like segregated from the rest of society. But yeah, in a lot of indigenous cultures, like that's not the case at all. I mean, I looked into Native American societies before Europeans arrived, and of course, we should remember that obviously there were like many different Native American tribes, and like who had all different cultures. Like they weren't just like one people; they weren't homogenous. But in many indigenous American cultures, children were like members of their community. And what I kind of mean by this is that they were kind of included into adult life in a way that kind of nowadays in the West, kids aren't. Like rather than kind of like, being segregated into like a school or a family or just having like special kid places, like children, they did do like, I guess you could say work, but most importantly, like this work wasn't in the sense we have in like a capitalist society. So this would be things like helping your family with certain things, like maybe like herding or like gathering or something like that. And yeah, the most notably, this wasn't work that was forced or coerced. It was usually voluntary. And the reason they did this is because in many of these indigenous societies, like being part of the community, like that's kind of an honor. And like kind of what's most notable is that rather than them kind of almost being seen as like property of like a parent or something like that, they are more so a part of the community. Like they're in harmony with the community. They're not just like a liability or like, somebody's property. And like that obviously kind of lines up to the child rearing practices kind of before the nuclear family and before the Industrial Revolution, where like rather than just a child just kind of being in this unit, like, you have a community, you have kind of almost like a kinship kind of model. So yeah, there has been a lot of consequences, obviously, to like colonialism in general. I mean, we kind of all know about that, but it's quite interesting to see how this has affected children in some of these places. In traditional Canadian Inuit society, adolescence, as it commonly is understood, did not exist. Instead, through constant intergenerational contact, children reach social and economic maturity at a relatively young age. Colonialism happened and a lot of Inuits were instead concentrated in settlements. With the introduction of formal schooling and television, then suddenly among the Inuit society, adolescence started to emerge as a category of childhood experience. The pressures of new social and economic expectations, combined with the loss of cultural and linguistic traditions, have led to an increase in drinking, violence, and youth suicide. So, yeah, these things have great consequences is what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. There is also, the invention of schooling in certain places, or at least westernized schooling in places like Africa, have also led to other things because, obviously there's the racism as well. They were being taught a Western version of history. And so a lot of these people felt disconnected from their actual origins and were basically told that they were inferior. Mm-hmm. And even nowadays, that through line is still in the African education system because it's just been so colonized. I guess I'll just talk about a few things I read. So I read about how some children in hunter-gatherer tribes in Africa struggle in school because they're kind of used to a certain kind of freedom that school doesn't allow them. And so, they get into a lot of trouble and all these things. And yeah, there's also a more darker aspect to this, just a trigger warning, corporal punishment. So I feel like people have a stereotype that like people of color are like super, super strict with their kids and they're like smacking them around. Mm-hmm. But in reality, like, corporal punishment didn't really exist in indigenous cultures. I mean, obviously this isn't the same everywhere. Like, I don't want to romanticize things. But it didn't really exist in like the ritualized way that had kind of taken place in Europe. I mean, it's ridiculous. But I mean, even in certain places in the US, like corporal punishment is still legal in schools. Mm-hmm. And like things like, like the paddle, that was actually originally used to discipline slaves. The issue of corporal punishment, which is actually a thread from colonialism and, and I guess you could say anti-child colonialism. Mm-hmm. And so the consequences of this in certain places like Africa is a lot of schools have major abuse problems. Like I've heard some pretty harrowing stories about people being beaten. And in addition to this, because obviously with colonialism inevitably comes a lot of sexual violence in a lot of these schools, in addition to corporal punishment and sexual violence kind of always have this connection. If like one is present, it's more likely the other is present as well. Mm-hmm. And so the consequences of enforcing what I call adult white supremacy is that a lot of indigenous children, a lot of children from the global south have become alienated, essentially, kind of like, I mean, all over the world.
Absolutely, completely agree with what you've been talking about. I mean, this is all stuff I think about a lot. it was ideas like this that were really important to me. Like before I even had kids, I've been thinking about youth rights really since I was a kid, just noticing like, oh, why are, what's going on? Like, why, I feel like a person, even though I'm a kid, why is this happening? And things like that, and thinking that different rules were unfair and stuff like that. But then fast forward to before my first child was born, who is an adult now, and then my second child is Imogen. But before my first one was born, and I read a book that influenced me a lot. And a lot of people that I end up agreeing with in my parenting have also read this book, and it's called The Continuum Concept. The Continuum Concept, and the point is when a baby is born, that baby doesn't know anything about capitalism and school and all this. So like, what is a baby really expecting? And it's the kind of stuff you were talking about. It's just, really being, what is like questions of like, what is a human being? Really, people of all ages have for hundreds of thousands of years, like lived in groups. Everyone's in the real world. Everyone's working together. You just learn as you go, whatever your culture does. That's what small children are going to learn, and they kind of gradually become part of the society. And somehow we got from there, at least in, really due to colonialism, which is the topic of this idea spread that we're putting people under 18 into this other space because it's so difficult maybe to get people to be part of this industrialized capitalist world that is not really what humans are built for. So maybe this is why we need these institutions to kind of make this happen, and really to use force to make that happen rather than let the family unit and I mean, maybe what the family unit would look different. Like, the group of people that you're around, your culture, it would be natural. When you see what small children do, they just kind of learn along with everyone else in their culture because they're important. They're helping people. They're this kind of thing. And so a big question is like, okay, so what do we do now? How can we bring some of these ideas into what we want to do going forward? And this Imogen had mentioned self-directed education, and this is some ideas in that, like whether you're unschooling or going to a self-directed education center or something like these are places, very small pockets of people that are trying to exist outside of mainstream culture and education, but that really has interested me.
It's interesting, like how hard it is for people to envision like a different form of education or just child rearing in general when like these practices are really what humans are meant to do. Like this is, before all this happens, industrialization, colonialism, like, and people just like can't really imagine that anymore.
And, I like what you mentioned about how children are kind of, I guess, segregated into different aspects of life, because there are a lot of ways where I feel like that happens. So, like, there's a lot of business bans where teenagers aren't allowed in certain businesses. Like, they'll literally be implementing these things called mosquitoes that play high-pitched frequencies to ward off specifically young people, but then older people can't hear it. And then they'll do and like curfews where, young people will get punished for being outside after a certain period of time. And then like certain laws where even if you're 16 and you have a driver's license, like you're not allowed to drive with a certain amount of other young people in your car. And there's a lot of ways that they're just trying to cut young people off from the rest of the world, or from, you said, like the real world, as a lot of people say it. And I feel like that is such a big thing of just this kind of pushing young people down to where they don't have an independence. And then they're trying to like restrict them from building that independence per se, like, with a lot of ways that I've done that with like a lot of social media bans and stuff, and like internet bans, and just saying like, yeah, no, you don't deserve to have access to this information just because you're young. But it's like, realistically, how are you going to learn if you don't have access to certain things? How are you going to like develop as an independent person if you're not allowed to go places with your friends, or you're not allowed to be outside after a certain period of time, or you're not allowed to have free access to information? So it really just goes back into all of these different ways that young people are oppressed. And, talking about that colonialism aspect, do you feel like these things that I'm mentioning, like, business bans, curfews, like information restrictions for young people and this kind of segregation of young people, do you feel like those types of ways that like we have in our society, do you feel like that goes back to colonialism and like industrial revolution?
I do feel like in recent years, like this has gotten way worse.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can even argue for adults. Like nowadays, a lot of adults are basically work, home, which is a lot like, the, reality children have gone through for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
The erasure, third spaces. And even though I say that children have kind of been segregated, which is very much true for a lot of Western history, I feel like in the past, like, perhaps when my mother was growing up, they were a lot more other options. But, people had like maybe a grandmother they could go to instead, or like, maybe they had like their school was running like a football club or something like that. So yeah, even though obviously it's still like kind of restricted to the family and also like the resources of the school, like there was a bit more, there was like a little bit more wiggle room. And I feel like that's slowly being erased. And what kind of happened in the past, what's happening now, but kind of even more severe, is basically a form of alienation. Like, I do think, I guess what you could say, the powers that be kind of do want young people to be alienated from what we call the real world. Because I think when I was younger, like, I wouldn't really accept certain things that I've kind of like internalized as normal now. Like, I feel like if we did let, young people interact with the world in perhaps the way some indigenous societies did, they'd see all this injustice. They'd see how, hyper-capitalism is destroying people's lives. And they might just say, I quit. I'm not going to participate in this, which would be terrible for, the people on top who need workers, who need people to accept the world as is.
Yeah, for sure. And I like what you mentioned about how it has kind of gotten worse a lot recently. Like what you mentioned about how young people did have a lot of other spaces they could go to up until relatively recently. Like a young person can just go to grandma's house or something, or they could just go to like the football club at their school. But now they're putting even restrictions on these types of things to where like I think 3 states off the top of my head, I know Texas and Utah did it, making it to where young people can't even join clubs at school without a parent permission. So there's certain laws about that. Yeah. And then there's other laws like harboring a runaway, for example, to where let's say a young person, they go to grandma's house without telling like without telling their parents. Like theoretically, if the parent is like doesn't want the kid at grandma's house and like they're not going and the parent doesn't want to resolve it in like a family matter, just be like, hey, can you bring him back? Let's say like they're having maybe like a dispute or something with like the relative, and the young person goes to that relative because they want to be away from the dispute. The parent can just like get the relative charged with a crime for letting the young person stay with them since the parent didn't consent to it. So it really brings it back to that nuclear family aspect of the way that the nuclear family gives the parents a monopoly on the kid's freedom. And like you were mentioning about property, treating young people like property because they can control all of these aspects of the young person's life.
I also think more and more as people are kind of forgetting this like older communal way of child rearing, like not just like, parents getting more and more control, but also like people who don't have kids, like the kind of ageist form of like the child free movement. It's like, no, I don't want to ever interact with a kid or a teen or whatever. Like we're kind of forgetting our collective responsibility towards younger people.
Yeah, totally. I mean, like, if you want to be child free, like good on you. Like, I'm actually quite happy that people who clearly don't get along with children are not having children anymore.
I mean, it's the type of child-free person I'm talking about.
Yeah, certainly. I do remember, I think this was around a year ago, but it was just popping up on like the internet where people would be like, oh, cinemas shouldn't have children in them, bars shouldn't have children, and restaurants shouldn't have children in them. And I guess from my background, like I guess there was a point in my life where I grew up quite poor. Like, that feels, not to be mean, but like it just feels like a very sheltered way of looking at the world. Like, because like when I go, like at time when I find myself in more like working class communities, like if there's a kid running around in like the pub here, then yeah, that's like pretty normal. Like that's just a part of being in public. Like, you know, like all of these things. So, but it feels very much like a more, again, going back to like, you know, nuclear family, like white normativity. It's very much like a very almost, yeah, kind of suburban concept. Like, oh, I am in my little bubble, and you know there can't be anything, you know, that disturbs me or anything. There can't be any children. There can't be like, you know, it's almost like a gentrified way of thinking, because you know, like from my perspective, like, you know, obviously, you know, as long as like it's not like, you know, actual like delinquency or like, you know, people are getting hurt, but like, yeah, just kids like being outside, being in public, that's just a part of life. And it just feels like such a sheltered opinion to me, in my opinion.
For sure.
It really does. I wonder how we got here. I would imagine that we all come from that place where, you know, kids are part of you know, the community in general, and then maybe there is something about gentrification, colonial lifestyle that it just increasingly, like maybe the more people have, or the more people are coming from a background where their group is trying to control other people, that that what you're talking about is happening. You know, and is becoming more visible in media and stuff, like, oh, this is something we should all aspire to, when really it seems like just the opposite. You lose so much when you're gaining that, you know, sort of isolated suburban lifestyle. So
yeah, and you know, like this existed before, but like I feel like nowadays with like, you know, I guess late stage capitalism, we are becoming like increasingly more and more isolated. Like loads of people, like I said, don't have birthplaces. They're just kind of isolated between like work and the home, and they don't really have much else. And that's not good. It's alienating. Like a lot of people just don't have community, and it's just the consequences of, you know, like I said, colonialism and, you know, capitalism becoming increasingly unsustainable.
Yeah, and also what you mentioned with that about like the isolation impact, because when young people are isolated from their communities, and it makes it to like the average adult who like doesn't have kids, they're not going to be interacting with a lot of like teenagers or anything like that. So it makes it easy for them to view them in a negative light, because maybe, you know, the stereotypes in media of, oh, the unruly delinquent teenagers that are just going to go out and outside and cause trouble and stuff like that. And it makes it to where if an adult isn't interacting with any teenagers, they're not connected to that community, they're just going to look at media, and that's like first thing in their head. They're like, oh, these unruly delinquents over here, I don't want to interact with them. I want to be away from them. And it makes it to where they become more supportive of things that therefore further isolate teenagers. So if they view teenagers in a way that's negative, they're going to be more in support of, like, you know, the business bans, the curfews, the ways that restrict young people from interacting with society. And the way to fix that, and the way to move past that, is to then attack the root of the issue, which what you said of the isolation, making it to where communities are interacting with each other. Adults and teenagers interact freely, and then when the adults get to know these teenagers and like actually get to like interact with them as individuals instead of just seeing them in media and stuff, they'll be like, oh yeah, this young person they're really smart. They're like basically just like someone who's exactly on my level. Like, it's not like there's some unruly delinquent that I see on TV. And then they'll be like, yeah, there's no reason that this person shouldn't be allowed outside. There's no reason that this person shouldn't be allowed in this movie theater or this business or something like that. And it really just goes back to that isolation element of the isolation furthers youth oppression.
On the subject of delinquency, I actually do live in a city where juvenile delinquency is a bit of a problem. They're called NEDs. We call them NEDs here. But yeah, it's certainly a problem. And I have heard people, you know, like a lot of these, like, I guess it's mostly like kind of a specific kind of like working class teenage boy, who kind of form gangs. And yeah, a lot of people are like legitimately afraid of them, but at the same time, like, obviously, you know, these kind of kids are coming from a very specific background. Obviously, like, you know, all these things we're talking about, curfew laws, like not letting people in your businesses, are not going to get to the root issue, and are definitely not going to stop the kind of teenagers who do actually hurt people. Like, it's just going to harm, I guess, like the vast majority of young people who aren't doing that, like, there are like kind of major issues behind this, and it's not just a case of literally every teenager being evil.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and we would never think like that with other groups of people. If like some certain adults are causing a nuisance or dangerous or whatever, it's not like, okay, everyone between the ages of 35 and 45, can't be out at this certain hour. That would just be insane, but for some reason with teenagers, that makes sense to people.
Society as a whole is comfortable discriminating against an entire demographic of people with nothing with nothing else but age. And they just look at age for these things. They're like, okay, these teenagers are over here being unruly, so we're going to put a curfew law that says everybody who's under this certain age can't be out after this time. And they don't look at like the individual context of a person's life. They just look at broad sweeping things to affect everyone that's part of this demographic. And that kind of backwards way of looking at it, which is just blatantly discriminatory against an entire group of people, that is also one of the roots of the issues. Because if you're a young person who's maybe not causing these problems, you're gonna look at it and you're gonna be like, why am I getting punished for something that I didn't even do? And it makes you think, and it pushes you into that mindset of being like that you're part of the problem, even though you're not. And it makes it to where when young people are like segregated and isolated away from these communities because of these policies, it makes it to where they then therefore go into these worse places, like with these gangs and stuff, because if they can be part of their community, they're going to form a little community on their own and then maybe not get into the best things just because they don't have access to being able to get into the right things.
Yeah, it's, again, just that alienation thing. And yeah, I guess kind of what you were saying, Susan, is I feel like my identity as a black person and my identity as a youth liberationist are very much connected, because I do notice that the way some people talk about young people, especially young people from marginalized backgrounds, is it almost has kind of similarities to racist talking points. Like, I mean, like there's this thing I hear from racists that they use to try and justify taking away black people's rights, which is basically, oh, black people commit a lot of crime or do these things, and therefore they don't deserve to have rights. And yeah, obviously that's wrong. Like, if they did a law right now, like, oh, black people aren't allowed outside at this time, like there would be outrage, and rightfully so. But for some reason, when we do this to another vulnerable group, young people in this case, like, it's seen as fine.
Mm-hmm.
Also, I'm sure a lot of these like anti-teen laws or whatever are going to disproportionately affect black youth, and yet people who claim to not be racist still, use these anti-youth talking points.
Yeah, I do feel like there are some people who, might have like some racist biases, sexist biases, what have you, who then instead kind of transform them into a more like ageist talking point. So instead of being like, oh, black teenagers make me uncomfortable, just be like, oh, like teenagers shouldn't be outside at night, and then everyone claps, like.
Mm-hmm. So, because that's acceptable.
It's just the most like acceptable form of bigotry to have. So if you have any others, it's easier to kind of funnel it into the more acceptable one.
Yeah, it's really about that acceptability, like the social acceptability of discriminating against young people. Because young people face so much systematic discrimination that you don't see a lot of the times. Like, for example, people under 25 can't even run to be a representative in the United States. And like, that's even way past the 18, like, of becoming an adult at that period of time. But you don't see that with other groups. Then when they do it to young people, though, that's seen as acceptable because it goes back to that, oh yeah, young people, they're too dumb, or they're too incompetent, or they don't know what's best for them, or like those arguments of just taking away from an entire group's like standing, I guess, and just talking down on them like they're less than. And it goes back to that just collective societal ageist rhetoric that people in power use.
Yeah, and I think, like, yeah, and these things have like real consequences. I think it's easy for people to say, like, oh, just wait until you're 25 to run. But like, I mean, here we have Parliament, or I guess where you are, you have Congress. But look, if you look at those two areas, it's full of a lot of, especially in Congress, just like old men. And the consequence of that is a lot of these old men are, understandably disconnected from the issues young people face, and like they can't really help them. And so, like, yeah, there's like a real societal consequence there, which is that, our politicians are disconnected from a good portion of the population's realities.
For sure. And also, when that aspect, a lot of the times used to justify is, oh yeah, young people are inexperienced, so they shouldn't be able to have the ability to run for these offices. But at the same time, how are they supposed to gain experience if they're, like, discriminated from? So it makes it to where you have to wait until you're older to gain experience. So by the time you actually get to a really good position of power, you're, like, really old at that point. And then, of course, you're disconnected from the issues that young people are facing because of the fact that you've just been put down when you were young, and the only opportunities you have is when you're older, and that's when you get into it. And, like, I feel like that's such a big problem as well about with these making our politicians just so disconnected from reality.
Yeah, like, oh, okay, like, a young person like yourself is too inexperienced to run for office, but like a 40-year-old Nepo baby who's never seen a homeless person can do that, like, through daddy's connections. Like, it doesn't really make much sense.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, this is why it's so important to have that representation. I mean, it's good for everyone to think about everyone, but you really need that representation. And historically, we've been through this again and again, a time when women couldn't vote, when people of color, Black, Indigenous people, can't vote, can't be full participants in society. All of the same arguments come out, like, that, it's for their own good. We need to, I mean, this comes back to our topic, colonialism. We need to sort of take care of these people. It's framed like that, like they're not ready. But, they don't have the same thought process of, like, it's going to be better for everyone if we just do this for them. And that has always been wrong. But, and every time, once that has opened up, and there's still people who, are discriminatory, but, like, as far as the law, once everyone can be equal before the law, it's then you can start moving forward. But the area where we're stuck is with youth. Because as we see, like at NYRA, we believe, if you're under 18, you should have rights, but it's a very fringe opinion still. And so, but it's really holding us back as far as, the liberation of everybody.
Yeah, I guess what some more cynical people argue, about women's rights and, Black liberation, all those things. I mean, like, even nowadays, like, still, Congress is full of, like, old white men, even though, like, women and minorities are still allowed to run. And although, obviously, this is, like, way better than it was, like, 60 years ago. But at the same time, I think a lot of these social issues kind of became profitable. Like, specifically, I think of, like, girl boss kind of ideology. And, like, how, like, you have, like, a t-shirt in Walmart that says girl boss on it that was probably made by, like, some female sweatshop workers in a third world country. Like, kind of like these empty gestures. Maybe youth rights isn't seen as, like, profitable. I don't know. But yeah, what I was going to say actually is, like, what you're saying about, certain groups being seen as childlike and not justifying taking their rights. Because, like, if you were going to talk about colonialism, a lot of these colonizers, like, they weren't just like, oh, we're just going to be evil and hurt these people. They almost saw themselves as almost like fathers. Like, in their minds, like, a lot of these indigenous groups were literally children. Like, not like metaphorically, they literally kind of saw them as inferior and childlike. And what I find interesting is, how this colonial project, how the justification of, oh, these people are children, and so we can do what we want to them, kind of coincides with the development of childhood throughout Europe. So, like, let's say the Middle Ages, like, childhood was very different. Actually, I'd say, like, even nowadays, even like 60 years ago, childhood was different, which just goes on to what I was saying before, is childhood is a social construct that is constantly changing and shifting. And yeah, so in the Middle Ages, like children were quite literally mini adults, but then something shifted. And some people say this was during the Renaissance and Protestant Reformation. The Protestants had a very unique view of children. They had this, I think it said somewhere, because of the imagery of like the Virgin Mary and the baby Jesus, like images of babies, of innocence, of youth became particularly important. And most notably, the Calvinists, who would be kind of the Puritans, the first kind of people to kind of first go into America, they started having kind of a belief about children that they were inherently sinful by nature, that they were incomplete in some way, which is a far cry from the Middle Ages where, children were, mini adults. But here now they're saying that actually, children kind of almost need to be beaten into Christianity. And this is kind of when we see in like the West, like children gradually becoming more subservient to adult authority rather than kind of being part of like the community or the adult community. And yeah, so kind of as colonialism kicked off, like there is a noticeable like shift towards how children are seen in general. So like, then there's the Enlightenment era, which had been like around the 1700s, and like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, if that rings a bell, a philosopher. But his whole thing was like the noble savage. And so he kind of painted a picture of children as like not people, but these innocent savages who, were like they were innocent, but ultimately they were uncivilized and inferior compared to adults who were, civilized men. And while that was happening, it just so happened that these colonized people were being characterized in a similar way as innocent savages. Like, there was this worldview that they were, very simple people, like, innocent from the realities of a civilized world, and ultimately needed to be guided and corrected. So, yeah, I find that very interesting because it's almost like as they were trying to use childhood as an excuse to do colonialism, the ideas of childhood we have now as the young person being inferior or, needing constant guidance or surveillance started to grow.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what you mentioned about the Puritanistic aspect goes back to a lot that happens in the world now. And it's a lot of a justification. Because when like governments run on these Puritanistic ideals, it promotes that idea that, oh, children are innocent and they shouldn't be able to make their own decisions. They need to be protected. They're vulnerable. They need to be protected. And we should be the ones protecting them because they're not smart enough to make their own decisions. They shouldn't have access to these things because they're too innocent for it. Their innocence need to be protected. And then they use that to justify like internet restrictions, social media bans, like even in some cases, like there's a big like movement in like religious communities to like not let children have access to like sexual education and stuff like that. And it goes back to this idea that children are so innocent, need to be protected, when realistically that's just hindering their development because it's not letting them have free access to information and ideas that allows them to grow up and, be actually informed about the world.
Even I remember like adults, I had adult authorities that just assumed, I didn't know anything, but I actually knew a lot more. And I feel like, a lot of people have experiences that where it turns out, the young person knows a lot more than you think. Mm-hmm. And yeah, just a lot of these government restrictions aren't just like an excuse to control young people. It's like supposed to try and control everyone and yeah, I think as the world is kind of becoming more fascistic, like usually even like with fascists in general, like the first people they usually target, I feel, is children, like controlling them, like, changing the curriculum in schools to fit their ideology. Mm-hmm. Because, as they say, children are the future. So how you're treated when you're young is very much going to influence about who you grow up into and what kind of things you accept. And while, obviously very young children should be protected from certain things, this idea of innocence is very interesting, particularly not just like the general concept, but like the Puritan idea of innocence. because ultimately it kind of entails inferiority in some way. Like it entails, that you need constant surveillance in some way.
And I like what you mentioned about the change in the curriculum being the first thing that they do, because like when young people are regulated to just having to be in these schools, or at least most of them, that's where their information is coming from. And if that's government controlled and then the government changes it to influence young people, that is then the first seeds of being able to kind of change the ways that society feels. And that's why, I mean, Susan Imogen can speak on this more than I can, but that's the importance of self-directed education, is making it to where it's not just one centralized authority being able to control the ideas of what's being taught in schools. It's more of like young people actually being able to do that in their own way.
Yeah, that's a thought I've had, because if just so happens a fascist government takes over, then the first thing they're going to do is try and influence the youth, because like I said, like what you learn about when you're young, the ideologies that you're taught, that's very more likely to influence you when you're an adult.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that's kind of one of the weaknesses of state-controlled education, is that around the Industrial Revolution, they kind of like started making schooling compulsory. And I guess the story we hear about that is like, it was this benevolent kind of thing. I mean, I don't know. I mean, you probably heard this in school, but like, it was like, oh, all these kids were working in factories, like miserable, but then school came along and then they were happy. But the reality is a lot more complicated. Like, while they were definitely like kind of humanist activists who were, who wanted children out of the factories and to get educated, on the other hand, like there was also a very capitalistic motivation, because at the same time, while all of this was going on, like, there was colonialism abroad. And one of the first things, I guess one of the things the colonizers did is erase indigenous teaching practices, because it wasn't just like, oh, you are now in the school and you are now learning. You learned from your community. You had like multiple teachers, and I guess you could say it was very much like self-directed, which is funny because like self-directed education is like, or schooling or whatever, is like the original way to teach a child. Like kind of what we have now with like, a very like rigid school system. That's actually a thing that is kind of more new. But anyway, like kind of what a lot of these colonialists did is that one of their main priorities was kind of teaching the locals their ways of doing things. And after a while, they also needed people who were educated to run certain things, like while like slavery happened in some places, like but yeah, they needed educated people as well. And so what they did is they started establishing schools, and a lot of these indigenous teaching practices were effectively wiped out because they didn't really fit in with the capitalist society they were developing. They didn't really have those values, because this version of education was more like lifelong, it was more like, of the pleasure of doing it. The schooling they brought to these countries was very oppressive. It basically kind of taught them a westernized version of history, and it taught them basically that the white people were the ones who were superior. And around the same, I guess sort of around the same time, schooling becomes compulsory in the West. And a lot of this is motivated not just by benevolence, but by the needs of society at the time, because they needed people who are more trained, but also this imperialist project needed citizens. Like they needed people who were loyal. They were seeing, these children in factories, and they're like, oh no, what are we doing to our citizens? Like, and that's kind of when the idea of children as like investments, like, in some educational theory I've read, I hear children and like young people described as investments when it comes to schooling. You put the investment in the bank, which is the school, and then later on they're able to generate more value for society. So yeah, that's kind of like the history of like school is quite complicated and very much rooted in quite a few other agendas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you've been mentioning, it's so much. It has been so wrapped in this benevolent, like we want to help children, when there's all these other agendas, like you've been talking about, and And that really continues to this day. Like, school is framed as this very helpful place, but when you stop and think about, like, what is the real purpose of it, and the purpose being historically and now not just like the information that's taught in the schools, but like how it's conveyed in this very compulsory, like, you must be here at these certain hours, you're going to be in trouble if you're not, if any family wants to do it a different way, that is not acceptable. And so historically it's really been people that had a whole way that they did things in their culture that was just like, no, going to do it our way now. So there's, in the message is very much like authorities are going to tell you what you need to know, what you need to learn, and that's the only way you can do things. If you don't follow this, things are going to turn out terribly for you. But even if you want to experiment with that, no, we're going to make you do it. So
I think the comparison between the lives of Indigenous children pre-colonization and the lives of children in the West while colonization was going on is quite interesting because, with the child working in the factory, a lot of the time, the reason they had child labor is because it was cheap, because they could pay the child less. And, obviously because most of these children, didn't have much of a choice, whether, mostly because of economic factors, because their family would starve, or sometimes they were kind of being pressured by their families to do it. Like, it was very much like coercive. And so like when schooling came along, what I noticed is there's still that coercive thread into it. I mean, like, the full picture we don't really get is like a lot of children actually resisted going to school. I mean, like some children, I think, chose to stay in the factory or tried to stay in the factory, but I do feel like a lot of reason was because they didn't want their family to like starve. But yeah, I also saw another interesting thing, which was about how some working class boys behaved in schools, which was, sometimes when they were put in these institutions, they'd be like super, like, they'd be laughing almost. They'd be like really baffled by how conformist some of their classmates were. Like, they kind of found the thing to be like quite absurd, which sadly was kind of a fulfilling prophecy, because, they wouldn't take it seriously, or they try to resist, and that would lead them to them failing school and then being back into the situation they once were in. But yeah, so like, this coercive framing of the world, whether it's through like capitalism or the state, versus the Indigenous child who is not doing this because, they need, is not participating in their community because they need like money, doesn't need to be forced to learn, is just enjoys being part of their community, has this strong community that encourages them and nurtures them. And so, yeah, I think that framing is very different. And I mean, obviously, I'd say, it's a bit complicated because obviously in the 19th century, schools were quite different, and oftentimes they employed the same kind of some of the same intimidation tactics. Like, if you were like a factory worker during the Industrial Revolution, your boss could like beat you up depending on where you were. And yeah, the same was in a lot of schools. Like, there was corporal punishment, and like, far worse than some that still exists now. It's almost like the school kind of became more so like a white collar version of child labor.
And there's also like the connection between the factory system of education that happens in schools, because when this compulsory education was coming out, it made it to where like the majority of people were going into like these like factory jobs where it's like what you're taught to do is just you're subservient to the person above you. You have to listen. You're not supposed to like spoke only when spoken to, only like answer questions. You're not supposed to like talk. Like if you're talking during class, like you get punished for that and stuff like that. And it's that factory system. And the way that school was originally set up was to train young people to go into that factory system. And while school has obviously evolved over the last like 100 years or so, it still has its roots. The system has roots in like that very authoritarian system. And that's why we see that schools are very authoritarian in the way they operate towards young people. And I feel like compulsory education in and of itself isn't necessarily terrible, but it's the way that you're forcing young people, but it's a lack of choice that young people have in what the school system entails. So if you're taking a young person, you're forcing them to be in a school where they have no choice and it's very authoritarian and they're being coerced, then that's wrong. So I feel like in order to fix the problems with compulsory education, you have to first reform the schools and basically go into like making it more self-directed, making it to where young people can choose what they want to learn, making it to where teachers don't have the authority to like search and seize and like punish people and like be extremely punitive. Like we shouldn't be policing schools. We shouldn't be like searching people's lockers and backpacks and taking their phones and stuff. Like don't make people feel like they're in a hostile situation where they don't have like personal rights over themselves. So that's a big thing for me, is just making sure that these school systems don't focus on this overly authoritarian way of treating young people, and that they focus on, you know, letting young people have choices in the decisions that they make and making it to where they don't feel like they're being put down by a system. But it has been about an hour, so I do think we're going to go ahead and wrap up. Well, yeah, I really liked everything you had to say about these connections because, you know, it informed me of a lot of new things that I didn't know before about, you know, especially with the corporal punishment aspect and stuff like that. But yeah, thank you for coming on. Thank you for sharing some of your research, and thanks everyone for being here. This was a great episode. And we'll see everyone in the next one.